Hi, it's very nice to be here. I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable right now because that was a terrible act to follow. I mean, he was just wonderful, the keynoter. There's also an awful lot of you here, so clearly we've hit a chord with this. Can we turn this down a little bit? It's booming like crazy. Is that possible? So, thanks. Yeah, with this theme. So what we're going to be looking at is this difficult issue of making money in a very rapidly evolving industry. Some sectors are going through evolutionary change, but others are going through really dramatic change. And this causes huge problems for organizations. We're going to be focusing quite a lot on existing organizations, and I hesitate to use the word legacy because actually things are moving so fast, startups become legacies really quite quickly. And a lot of us will face the situation of trying to adapt existing organizations to very fast-changing environments. My background is, I have kind of a hybrid background. I'm a researcher, and for the last 15 years I've been looking really hard at organizations that are getting it right, especially old legacy organizations, and I've spent a lot of time inside the BBC trying to understand why they got it so right with all their various digital initiatives, and really trying to look at what I'm going to look at is probably the most boring of the three lectures talks we've got just right now, because what it's come down to from my research has been looking at very pragmatic ways about how organizations are put together that allow new business models to emerge. And then we're going to move on to Rebecca from Hearst and Oye from Spotify, and they're going to talk about two particular aspects of media content and business models that work in that sphere. And so this is a kind of scene-setting session, and I've taken this phrase from William Goldman. I don't know how many of you know this phrase. Nobody knows anything. This was the opening of his memoir. He is one of the great script writers in Hollywood. He wrote a great memoir about the entertainment industry in the US. And he said, basically, this was in the 1980s, 1990s, nobody knows anything. And I think actually that phenomenon has kind of got worse. So for those of us in the media, to some extent, I think it feels like we're kind of groping in the dark. We have existing models, and if you're in the press area, they are deteriorating as one speaks. You have emerging models coming up. Nothing is quite proven. That having been said, there do seem to me some truisms, some of which are kind of counterintuitive in the current environment. I think the first and probably the most difficult to deal with is that mastery of the current environment is really no guarantee of mastering future ones. And this is a very unpleasant pattern that you see everywhere. I mean, if you look at who owned music you walk around with, it was Sony and the Walkman, but they never really kind of made the jump. They couldn't create the iPod, even though they clearly had the resources, the technologies, the capabilities to do that. If you look at each successive era of technology, you find that whoever led during that era very seldom leads in the next one. So Microsoft never really got a position in the internet era as great as it had in personal computing. Google, who owns search, is having problems getting an equivalent position in social networking. So there seems to be a really nasty dynamic whereby if you really are very successful in one area, that almost predestines you to not do well in the next. And if you look at why that happens, it does come down to all kinds of it comes down to a kind of constellations of things that happen inside organizations when they have leading positions. You know, a lot of it is kind of about ego, about complacency, but an awful lot of it's also about running organizations well and lean and efficiently. And when you do that, what you tend to do is crowd out any space to innovate. It's very Darwinian, the world we're looking at. It's really not the strongest survive, it's the ones that can adapt the best. And that's often why we see the firms that establish themselves as the leader don't have the most elegant product. It's not the best. There are better things out there. They're just more adaptable. So that becomes a really, really important organizational imperative, whatever the size of the organization. It's very hard to extrapolate in the media area. You know, we talk about the media as one big collective industry. It's not. It's about 27 to 30 different sectors that behave in very different ways. And the problem for that is you can't really transfer the learning. You might have a great solution for recorded music. You can't say that's going to work for ebooks. What works in scientific magazines won't necessarily work in newspapers. So that's hard. It's hard to find a basis of knowledge, of expertise to build across from. And clearly there's no magic bullet. We're talking about iterative evolution. Now, that having been said, if you look at the companies that are getting it right, the business models that are working, if you dig down into how those organizations operate, there are two principles that do seem to me that they kind of have a lot of validity. And the first is actually iterative, this word iterative development. Just keep trying till you get it right. And actually, the example I use for this is the Guardian newspaper in the UK, which a lot of you will know. It's particularly strong in the media. And this is the kind of traditional business model structure they had. That's their value chain. And that was what you saw across the whole media industry, some kind of variant of this for the last 20, 30 years. Create the content, package it up into some kind of format, produce it on a mass market basis and send it out. If you look at what their business model looks like now, they've just patched on all of these other activities around it. Some have been successful, some haven't. So they've added blogs to classical journalism. They've put all of their classifieds into kind of online bases. They've gone into podcasts. They've set up a very successful agency selling their digital know-how for other organizations. So they've tried to actually, instead of sell a product, sell their expertise. You look at what they're doing, they're just patching on new activities and revenue streams in a very exploratory way. So some of them have stopped. They bought the portal Paid Content for a while, which is a kind of specialist blog on the media industry. They sold it. Gone very heavily into people media, events like this, conferences, book festivals, classes where you can learn to become a Guardian photojournalist, classes where you can learn to be a book reviewer. They've expanded over more media platforms, so they've taken this print product, they've gone out over all media platforms, but then they've tried to look for niches within that. So the niches they're looking at are the public sector teaching, particularly the environment and the media. And then they've tried to go global within those sectors. And the other, I think, principle that really seems to be working, if you look at the organizations that are doing well, is a kind of principle of hybridity. When the whole digital revolution took place, we got very binary in our thinking. It was either old media or new media, and the new media worked in completely different ways to the old media. And what we're looking at, the models that are really working well, tend to be hybrid. They're combining old and new in this kind of evolutionary way. And actually the best example of this is a media product that is completely hybrid but has the kind of appearance of being very legacy media, which will probably make a lot of you wince. And it's from a sector that is really blooming worldwide, is now become one of the most powerful segments of the media industry, and that's the international TV format business. So this is laying aside any reservations which may be entirely justified, any prejudices you have, a really interesting model is the X Factor. If any of you have ever seen this program, it's a perfect hybrid. You know, a hybrid car, a lot of us are driving them. They've got the fuel motor and they've got the electric motor. So what you see is that the fuel motor in this program, in this model, which is really the development of one guy, Simon Cowell, is old-fashioned mass-market appointment-based TV viewing. Saturday night, whole family sits down and watches it. Sunday night, there's the results show. And then there's 2 other programs around it. So you've got 4 TV programs a week produced by a TV company that buys the license from Simon Cowell TV. And they'll normally do that in association with a TV production house. Huge amount of use is made of the tabloid press. Very heavy PR activity, pushing stories out about this C, D, E, F list celebrities who are being created in the program to stoke interest in the program. The program is used to select future music stars whose tracks are sold on iTunes and so on. But then around that, you have an enormous amount of website activity, Twitter activity, Facebook activity. And if you look at what the beauty is of this model, is it seamlessly combines old and new media. It's sitting on top of other organizations' legacy assets. So if you look at what is really killing established media organizations, it's all of their legacy assets. You know, the reason why The Guardian, despite its very successful digital strategy, is still in very perilous financial situations is it didn't really pull back on its physical assets quickly enough. He has no physical assets, Simon Cowell. He's sold this concept to 19 different countries. But it's a very virtual concept. He's selling the idea. It's multi-product, multi-platform, multinational. He's got internet, music, TV, print, physical concert performances, downloads, multiple revenue streams. That's another thing you see in the business models that work. You need more than one revenue stream coming in to cope with the vagaries of the industry we're in. And he's got a kind of hybrid marketing machine. So he's using the press, old-fashioned press, to stoke interest in the product, to get people to watch. During the program, he's using social media to keep everyone involved, everyone voting. Of course, he's getting a cut of the SMS voting revenues. And he's now, I think, the 68th richest person in the UK. He's got other models, but this is, I think it's not an elegant program, it's not a beautiful program, but some of the thinking behind it is very clever. And he's a perfect example of trial and error. He's been bankrupt once or twice. I mean, he's really put his learning into place. So if we try and just pull back quickly, I'd just like to finish off by looking at what happens within organizations to try and enable this kind of iterative development and hybrid development to happen. And what you're actually turning back to in the media is what has always happened in the smaller, less well-financed areas of the media. It's this strategy of just throwing mud at the wall, throwing products out and see what sticks. You know, the book publishing industry, which has always been very underfunded, smaller music labels have always done this. Organizations that don't have the luxury to engage in huge amounts of market research or would never have the money to buy J.K. Rowling or Madonna. This is the strategy they've had to adapt. But interestingly, what we're seeing now is companies like Google, the big players in the industry, are doing this mud-at-the-wall strategy as well. So what you seem to be doing here is it's a numbers game. The more shots, the more goals. You increase the odds of success in the current environment by increasing the number of attempts. And the trick is to bring down the cost of making the attempts. So find a faster way. Quick and dirty experimentation, fast, cheap, releases better, discard if it's not working. And this is, of course, it's been celebrated as the Google approach. And, you know, if you look back over recent years, there's quite a lot of things that Google has launched that have just quietly died. The problem is we've heard an awful lot about this, almost to the point, you know, try more, fail more, learn more. It's become a bit of a blah, blah, blah. What actually happens in the organizations that I've studied where it's really worked, firstly, an acceptance that boring, prosaic organizational changes are one of the kind of big secrets here. Secondly, what you seem to be looking at is very low-profile innovation teams. The reason they're low-profile is you will be guaranteeing failure if you celebrate these people as the new evangelists who are going to save the organization. What kicks in is a kind of autoimmune system rejection where the rest of the organization that's still got to do the work, doing the boring old stuff, generating the profits, starts to resent them so much they basically subvert the new teams from inside. So you keep them off the radar screen. You don't make them into heroes. You give them a clear mandate and you get out of the way. And this was actually something that BBC News Online did. John Burt gave a small self-selected group of journalists who were personally interested in the internet and said, just find a way to make what we've always done, public service news, work on the internet. Use the functionalities of the internet to enhance what the BBC has always done. And then he never visited the unit once. He followed it at a distance, but he never kind of stuck his nose in and fiddled around and revised plans. He said, it's entirely up to you. Where do you start? Well, Simon Waldman, who was the first digital architect at the Guardian, his method is you start with organic growth opportunities in adjacent fields. And his theory is you should know one thing. You should either know the market or know the product, and then you expand. So you either do a new product for an existing market, or you do a a new market for a product you know really well. I don't know if I got that right, but you know where I'm going with that. The teams need to have autonomy. This is really first among equals. There's a fantastic body of thought about how you make organizations more creative. And in the media area, tech sectors, creative industries, autonomy is first among equals. You know, we heard that this morning. Our speaker, he basically wanted to be left alone to be an individual to do. He had so much passion, he could really do extraordinary things provided people didn't interfere with him. So this autonomy is incredibly important. And actually, if you screen across the most successful media organizations, even amazingly, Rupert Murdoch at News International, they understand this theory. It's part of the organization's DNA. And what they need to be able to do, what these teams need to be able to do, is focus on these new ideas without trying to worry about what kind of conflicts are going to be with what's happening in the existing organization. Sooner or later, someone has to address those issues, but not during this kind of growth period. They need the freedom to be free from administrative process/bureaucracy that make a huge amount of sense for large, successful companies, but can strangle new ideas at birth. They need to be left alone to get things wrong and not to have to explain why they've got things wrong. These are very rapidly evolving fields, and you need to just make sure people are getting the learning from their mistakes, but they don't need to have to justify why they got it wrong. They need to have the freedom to change direction midstream, and really crucially to let recommendation and word of mouth take off. In the media field, that's such an important engine. And there is a time lag before that starts to kick off. Once it kicks in, it's exponential, but there needs to be a window where that can happen. And the last thing is really find all those hidden hurdles that are often disguised as good management and are part of good management. And those hidden hurdles are actually what brings down the market leaders. So it's all of these complex approval procedures that make a lot of sense if you're making a huge capital expenditure investment, but really have nothing to do with very small experiments. Performance metrics. You know, it's very hard to design performance metrics for emerging markets, for fringe activities. But if you don't have any, then those markets are basically ignored by the most important people in the organization. So you need to find some way, however crude, of making sure that the organization's eyes are focused on all the new fringe areas where the real growth is going to be. A culture that makes a big idea of failure, and that's so common, especially in creative organizations where peer approval is so important. You know, your credibility depends actually in the end not what the market thinks, but what people you admire think of you. And in those organizations, it can be very, very hard and painful to fail. So you've got to really reframe failure. And the last thing, which is really subtle, is look at how ideas flow within the organization. Once organizations get to a certain size, which actually can be, you know, about 21 people sometimes, it can be very hard for good ideas from the fringes and the periphery and lower down the organization to move up. There's always very good corporate communication strategies for information to come down and out and into the wider market. But actually to capture all those great ideas from often the divergent thinkers in the organization, a lot of equal amount of energy needs to be put into capturing those. So that's it from me. That's a bit organizational. I hope that's not too organizational for you. I'd like to move on now to Rebecca from Hearst Magazines, and then we will have time for questions after Rebecca and at the end of the session as well. So thank you very much.